My wedding dress cost $2,400. I know that because I paid for it myself. Not because my father couldn't afford it. Richard Callahan was worth $4.2 million the morning I walked down that aisle. I know that number precisely because I had built most of it, quarter by quarter, client by client, over 8 years of my life. I paid for my own dress because my father had already spent that morning signing something far more expensive. He signed his company over to my brother Dylan. Not after dinner, not at a family meeting, not with a conversation that gave me even 30 seconds to respond. He signed it at 9:14 a.m. on September 6, 2022, while I was in a bridal suite 6 miles away having my hair pinned back by a woman named Gloria who kept telling me how lucky I was. I found out the way you find out things that were never meant for you. A text, sent to the wrong Callahan. Congratulations, Dylan, it's yours now. Your father just called. You deserve every bit of it. The name at the top of that message was Gary Hoffmann, our largest client, $1.3 million annually. A man I had personally flown to meet in Houston in February 2019 when his previous vendor collapsed, and he needed someone on the ground in 48 hours. I was the one who answered that call. I was the one on the plane. Dylan was in Cabo that weekend. I remember because he sent a group photo to the family chat. Frozen margarita. Sunset. # living his best life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand what happened on September 6th, you need to understand what Callahan Logistics looked like in January 2014, the month I came home from college and walked into my father's office for the first time as an employee. If you've ever poured everything you had into something that someone else put their name on, stay with me. Drop your location in the comments right now. I want to know where you're watching from. Richard Callahan started Callahan Logistics in 1998 out of a leased warehouse in Columbus, Ohio. 2 trucks, a fax machine, 3 employees, including himself. By the time I joined in 2014, it had grown to a respectable regional operation. 11 trucks, 22 employees, revenue sitting at $1.8 million annually. Respectable, stable, and completely stuck. My father was a builder in the earliest sense of the word. He could start something from raw instinct and sheer force of personality. What he could not do was scale it. He didn't understand systems. He didn't understand contracts beyond a handshake. He didn't understand that a logistics company in 2014 that wasn't investing in route optimization software was already 3 years behind. I understood all of it. I had a degree in supply chain management from Ohio State. I had interned 2 summers at a mid-size freight company in Cincinnati where I watched a $6 million operation run like a clock. I came home with a notebook full of ideas and a hunger I genuinely believe my father would recognize. He recognized something different. You can start and dispatch, he said the first morning. No welcome, no vision, just a chair, a headset, and a scheduling board that hadn't been updated since Tuesday. I sat down. I put on the headset, and I started. Within 4 months, I had rebuilt the entire dispatch system from a whiteboard operation to a software-managed routing platform. I sourced the software myself, negotiated the licensing cost down from $1,400 a month to $890 by committing to an 18-month contract, and trained every driver personally over 3 consecutive Saturdays. My father's response was a single sentence delivered over a gas station coffee on a Monday morning. Don't overspend on things we don't need, Emma. No acknowledgement that on-time delivery rates had improved by 23% in 60 days. No recognition that 2 clients had specifically called the office to compliment the new system. Just don't overspend. I filed that moment in a folder in my mind that I would spend the next 8 years filling. Dylan joined the company in 2017. He was 23. He had spent 2 years after high school doing what my father called finding himself, and what the rest of us called spending Richard's money in increasingly creative locations. He was given the title of Business Development Manager. In practice, that meant Dylan attended the golf days. He showed up at the Christmas client dinners I had organized, in a suit I suspected had never seen a dry cleaner, and he shook hands and laughed at the right moments. He had our father's easiness with a room. That particular gift of making people feel like the most interesting person alive for exactly as long as it was useful. He closed 2 contracts in his first year. I want to be fair about that. 2 contracts. One was a referral from a family friend that would have called us regardless. The other was a mid-size hardware distributor I had already been in correspondence with for 6 weeks before Dylan had a single lunch with their procurement director and came back declaring victory. He received a bonus for that contract. I had already moved on to the next problem. That was the arrangement, spoken or not. By the end of 2021, Callahan Logistics had 200 employees, 41 trucks, revenue of $14.3 million. We had expanded into freight brokerage, added a warehousing division, and signed 3 enterprise-level clients including Gary Hoffmann's distribution company. Every single one of those expansions had my fingerprints on it. Not Dylan's, not Richard's, mine. And on the morning I was supposed to become Emma Callahan Walsh, my father decided that none of that mattered. But here's what neither of them knew. I had been quietly preparing for this possibility for longer than either of them would ever imagine. I stared at that text for 47 seconds. I know because the timestamp on Gary Hoffmann's message was 9:21 a.m., and when I finally set my phone face down on the vanity table it was 9:22. Gloria had just finished the last pin. She was saying something about the light in the room being perfect. I smiled at her in the mirror and told her it was beautiful. My hands were completely still. That is the detail I remember most. Not the tears, because there weren't any. Not the anger, because it hadn't arrived yet. Just my hands, flat on the vanity table, perfectly still, while something inside my chest quietly collapsed like a structure that had been compromised for years and had finally found its moment. I excused myself to the bathroom, locked the door, read the message 4 more times. Then I opened my contacts, scrolled to a name I had been calling for 8 years, and typed 3 words back. Did you know? The 3 dots appeared immediately, then disappeared, then appeared again. My maid of honor Sandra knocked on the door, asking if everything was okay. I told her I needed 5 minutes. She said Marcus was asking about me. I said tell him I'm fine. The reply from my contact came 40 seconds later. Emma, I'm so sorry. I just found out this morning. He had the lawyers come to the house last night. I didn't know until it was already done. That was Janet Okafor, our head of finance. 17 years with Callahan Logistics. The woman who had taught me how to read a balance sheet in 2014, sitting at a folding table in a warehouse that smelled like diesel and burnt coffee. If Janet didn't know until it was done, that meant my father had been planning this in deliberate silence. This wasn't a decision made in haste. This was architecture. Careful, intentional, and built specifically so that I would not see it coming. I sat on the edge of that bathroom bathtub in a $2,400 dress and understood something with a clarity that surprised me. He had always planned this. The question was never whether Dylan would inherit the company. The question was only when. Everything else, every year, every system I built, every client I flew to meet, every problem I solved at 11 p.m. while Dylan was at a rooftop bar somewhere, all of it had been my audition for a role that was never actually available. I walked back out into that bridal suite, smiled at Gloria, accepted the bouquet Sandra handed me, and married Marcus Walsh at 2 p.m. in front of 140 people. My father gave a speech at the reception. He talked about watching me grow up. He talked about how proud he was. He used the word remarkable twice. He raised a glass, and every person in that room raised one with him. I raised mine too, smiled at exactly the right moment, said thank you when he hugged me afterward. Marcus noticed something was wrong on the drive to the hotel. He didn't push. He just reached across the center console, put his hand over mine, and said, "Whenever you're ready." I told him everything that night, sitting on the edge of a king-size bed in a hotel room in downtown Columbus, still in my wedding dress because neither of us had thought to suggest I change. I talked for an hour and 20 minutes. Marcus didn't interrupt once. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I have thought about almost every day since. So what are you going to build next? Not are you okay? Not what are you going to do about your father? Not this is wrong and someone should say something. Just, what are you going to build next? I looked at him for a moment. Then something shifted behind my eyes that I can only describe as a door closing. Quietly, with intention. Something they can't ignore, I said. I want to stop here for a second because I know what some of you are thinking. Why didn't you confront your father that night? Why didn't you walk into that reception and demand an explanation in front of 140 witnesses? I'll tell you why. Because I had watched Richard Callahan operate for 31 years. I knew exactly how that conversation would go. He would explain it as a business decision. He would use words like legacy and stability and what's best for the company long term. He would find a way to make my anger look like instability, and Dylan would stand slightly behind him with that easy smile, saying nothing, because Dylan had never needed to say anything. That was always the arrangement. Confronting my father that night would have cost me everything and gained me nothing. What I needed was not a conversation. What I needed was a plan. And I had actually been building one, in pieces, without fully admitting it to myself, for almost 2 years. Janet called me the Monday after I returned from my honeymoon, 7 days after the signing. Her voice was careful the way it gets when she's delivering information she's already organized into categories. She told me that the transfer was complete and legally airtight. She told me Dylan had already moved into the corner office, the one with the window overlooking the loading dock that my father had occupied for 24 years. She told me that Dylan had held a staff meeting the previous Thursday and announced that the company was entering a new era. Then she paused. He introduced himself as the founder's son, she said. Not as the new CEO, as the founder's son. I wrote that down, exactly as she said it. Founder's son, not the person who rebuilt Dispatch. Not the person who negotiated the Hoffmann contract. Not the person who had spent 8 years turning $1.8 million into $14.3 million. The founder's son. Janet, I said, how long until your non-compete expires? Silence. Then a sound that was almost a laugh. 14 months, she said. I'll call you in 13, I said. I hung up, opened a new document on my laptop, and typed 2 words at the top of an otherwise empty page. Callahan's replacement. I registered the LLC on a Tuesday morning in November 2022. Apex Freight Solutions. $150 filing fee. A business address at a shared office space on the east side of Columbus that cost me $200 a month and smelled faintly of someone else's ambition. Marcus co-signed the initial business loan. $85,000 from a regional bank whose commercial lending officer had asked me 3 times during the application meeting whether I had any prior experience running a logistics operation. I answered the same way each time. Calmly, with specifics. By the 3rd time he stopped asking and started taking notes. I want to be honest about those first 4 months because I think people who tell these stories sometimes sand down the difficult parts until they shine like something they're not. It was brutal. I was working from a laptop at our kitchen table from 5 a.m. until Marcus came home at 6 p.m., and then again from 9 p.m. until midnight. I was building carrier networks, negotiating insurance rates, filing for operating authority with the FMCSA, designing service agreements, and cold calling freight brokers who had never heard of me and had no particular reason to care. I had left Callahan Logistics quietly 2 weeks after the transfer. No dramatic exit. No farewell speech. I submitted a standard resignation letter that said I was pursuing other opportunities and thanked the company for 8 years of experience. I shook hands with people I had hired, trained, and worked alongside for nearly a decade. I did not go near Dylan's office. My father called that evening. I let it go to voicemail. He said he hoped we could remain close as a family and that he wished me well in whatever came next. His voice had the particular quality of a man who had rehearsed the call twice and was relieved to get the machine. I deleted it after 1 listen. I had work to do. By March 2023, I had 4 clients. Small accounts, a regional furniture manufacturer, a farm equipment distributor, a medical supply company running routes between Columbus and Cleveland, and a craft brewery that needed weekly refrigerated transport to 3 states. Combined monthly revenue was $47,000, enough to cover the loan payment, the office space, 2 part-time contractors I had brought on for dispatch, and a thin margin that I immediately reinvested into carrier capacity. I worked every angle I knew. I undercut Callahan's rates on 3 specific lane types, where I knew from 8 years of internal data that their margins were fattest. I offered service-level guarantees that the larger players in the market wouldn't touch because their operations were too rigid to back them up. I answered my phone personally until 10 p.m. every night because I knew from experience that the single thing midsize shippers hate most is a vendor who disappears after the contract is signed. Every strategy one used came directly from problems I had watched Callahan Logistics fail to solve for years. I wasn't guessing at what the market needed. I had spent 8 years documenting it from the inside. What do you think happened when my former colleagues started noticing what I was building? Drop it in the comments. Did they stay quiet? Did they reach out? Or did word get back to Dylan before I was ready? Keep reading because the answer surprised even me. Janet Okafor called me in month 11. 1 month ahead of schedule. Her non-compete had a specific carve-out clause she had quietly negotiated into her original contract 7 years earlier, one that excluded her from restrictions if her role was materially altered without mutual agreement. Dylan had restructured her position in January, cutting her strategic responsibilities and folding her team under an external accounting firm he had brought in, apparently on the recommendation of a golf contact. That carve-out made her available immediately. She arrived at my kitchen table on a Wednesday morning with a leather folder, a flash drive, and 17 years of institutional knowledge that no amount of money could have bought on the open market. We talked for 4 hours. By the end of it, she had a title, Chief Financial Officer, a salary I stretched my projections to make work, and an equity stake that I insisted on because I had watched what happened when the people who built something were given everything except ownership. Janet looked at the offer letter for a long moment. "You know this is going to get back to Richard," she said. "I'm counting on it," I said. She signed it right there at the kitchen table. Used my pen. 2 weeks after Janet joined, I hired an operations manager named Troy Sellers who had spent 6 years running regional dispatch for a national carrier and had been quietly unhappy for most of them. Then I brought on 2 of the best drivers from Callahan's Columbus fleet, both of whom had called me personally after hearing through the driver network that I had left. I want to be clear that I never solicited a single Callahan employee directly. Every person who came to Apex came because they had heard what I was building and made their own decision to find me. I was meticulous about that distinction because I knew the day was coming when it would matter legally. By September 2023, exactly 1 year after my wedding day, Apex Freight Solutions had 23 employees, 12 carrier partnerships, and monthly revenue of $340,000. I sat in my actual office by then, a real one, 2,800 square feet in a business park off I-270, and I looked at those numbers on Janet's latest report and felt something I had to consciously identify before I recognized it. Not satisfaction, not relief, readiness, because I had spent that entire year doing something else alongside the building, something I had never mentioned to anyone except Marcus and Janet. I had been preparing a proposal, the kind that lands on a decision-maker's desk and does not leave room for a second option. And the company I was preparing it for was Gary Hoffmann's. The same Gary Hoffmann, whose congratulatory text to Dylan I had read in a bridal suite mirror 13 months earlier, while Gloria told me how lucky I was. I want to tell you something about Gary Hoffmann before I tell you what I did next. Gary was not a sentimental man. He had built his distribution company from a single warehouse in Dayton over 30 years, and he had done it by making decisions with a kind of cold precision that made his competitors assume he was personally unpleasant. He wasn't. He was simply allergic to inefficiency in all its forms, including the social kind. He didn't do loyalty for loyalty's sake. He did results, which meant that what I was about to propose had to be bulletproof. Not better than Callahan Logistics. Measurably, documentably, undeniably superior in every metric Gary Hoffmann had ever told me he cared about. I knew what those metrics were because I had been the one sitting across from him for 4 years of quarterly reviews. Janet and I spent 6 weeks building the proposal. Not designing it, building it, the way you build something structural, with load-bearing specifics and no decorative language. We pulled lane-by-lane performance data from public freight databases and cross-referenced it against the service benchmarks I knew Callahan had been quietly missing since Dylan reorganized the operations team in early 2023. We priced it to win without bleeding ourselves. Janet was precise about that. She ran the margin analysis 4 times until the number was exactly aggressive enough to make Gary's procurement team uncomfortable about staying where they were, but not so low that it signaled desperation. The proposal was 41 pages. I had written every word personally. I submitted it on October 3, 2023, through Hoffmann Distribution's standard vendor portal, the same portal I had helped Gary's team build the intake process for back in 2020. Then I waited. What I did not anticipate was that Gary Hoffmann would call me directly 4 days later. Not his procurement team, not a junior buyer. Gary himself, at 7:43 in the morning, from a number I still had saved in my phone under the contact name I had given him in 2019. Emma Callahan, he said. He always used both names. Old habit. Walsh now, I said. But yes. A pause. Then something that on Gary Hoffmann's spectrum of emotional expression qualified as a laugh. I wondered when this was coming, he said. I did not answer that. I had learned from watching my father negotiate for years that silence in the right moment is worth more than any sentence you could fill it with. Walk me through your capacity on the Southern Ohio lanes, Gary said. I walked him through it. 12 minutes. No filler, no relationship language, no reminiscing about the Houston trip. Just numbers, timelines, and carrier commitments I had already secured specifically for his volume profile. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. I have 8 months left on my current contract, he said. I know, I said. Because I did. I had been the one who negotiated the original term length. Send me a revised proposal with the Q1 rate lock included, he said. And Emma, don't tell anyone we spoke. I told him I wouldn't. I meant it. Marcus found me at the kitchen table at 11 p.m. that same night. I had been sitting there for 3 hours with my laptop open and a coffee that had gone cold 2 hours earlier. He looked at my face and pulled out the chair across from me. How bad is it? He said. It wasn't a question. With Marcus it rarely was. It's not bad, I said. It's happening. He looked at the screen. At the revised proposal open in front of me. At the Hoffmann distribution letterhead on the reference document beside it. He was quiet for a moment. Does your father know? He said. Not yet. When will he? I closed the laptop. When it's too late to matter, I said. Marcus nodded slowly. He got up, poured my cold coffee down the sink, made a fresh cup, and set it in front of me without a word. Then he went to bed. That was the thing about Marcus that I had understood within the first year of knowing him. He never tried to talk me out of anything I had already decided. He just made sure I was fed and caffeinated while I executed it. In December 2023, I received a formal letter from Hoffmann Distribution's legal team confirming their intent to transition their primary freight contract to Apex Freight Solutions effective upon expiration of their existing agreement in June 2024. $1.3 million annually. The exact same number that had appeared on that congratulatory text in a bridal suite mirror 15 months earlier. Janet framed the letter. I am not joking. She had it in a simple black frame on her office wall within a week of it arriving. No caption, no explanation, just the letter. I did not frame it. I filed it and moved on to the next problem because there was still 6 months between that letter and the actual contract start date, and I had learned from 8 years inside a family business that nothing is real until the invoice is paid. But something else happened in January 2024 that I had not planned for. My father called. Not a voicemail this time. A real call, at 6 p.m. on a Wednesday, that I answered because something in the specific timing of it told me this was not a social call. I heard you started a company, he said. I did, I said. Logistics. Yes. A silence that had a particular texture to it. The texture of a man recalibrating something he thought he had already settled. You could have talked to me, Emma, he said. We could have worked something out. I let that sentence exist in the air for a moment. I thought about the 9:14 a.m. timestamp. I thought about lawyers coming to the house the night before my wedding. I thought about a corner office and the words founder's son delivered to a room full of people who knew exactly who had built what. What would we have worked out, Dad? I said. He didn't answer. I didn't think so, I said. I told him I had to go. I was polite about it. I always am. Politeness costs nothing, and in my experience it unsettles people far more than anger ever could. I hung up and sat for a moment in the particular silence that follows a conversation that has finally said everything it needed to say without saying any of it directly. Then I opened my laptop and went back to work. Because in 6 months, Gary Hoffmann's contract was going to transfer, and my father's company was going to lose $1.3 million in annual revenue in a single quarter, and somewhere between now and then Dylan was going to figure out what was happening, and there was absolutely nothing either of them could do about it. I had made sure of that. Carefully. Legally. Completely. But here's what I hadn't prepared for. The way I would feel when it actually happened. June 2024 arrived the way important months always do. Quietly, without ceremony, indistinguishable from any other Monday morning until suddenly it wasn't. The contract transfer executed on June 2nd. A standard operational handover. Janet managed the paperwork. Troy coordinated the first live pickup. The drivers ran the route without a single exception. By 6 p.m. that evening, Gary Hoffmann's freight was moving under Apex's operating authority, and Callahan Logistics had lost its largest single client without a public announcement, without a press release, without anything except a termination notice that had been sitting in Dylan's inbox since March. I know Dylan had seen it, because Janet still had a contact inside Callahan's admin team who told her that Dylan had forwarded the notice to my father with a single line of text. It said, "Did you know about this? I want you to sit with that for a moment." The man who had been handed a $14 million company on the morning of his sister's wedding, who had moved into the corner office and announced himself as the founder's son, was forwarding a client termination notice to a 62-year-old man asking if he knew about it. He had been CEO for 21 months, and he still didn't know how to read a client exit. The industry event was Janet's idea, the Midwest Freight and Logistics Summit, held annually at the Hilton Columbus downtown. 400 attendees, carriers, shippers, brokers, technology vendors, and every mid to large-scale logistics operator in a 6-state region. Callahan Logistics had attended every year since 2016. I had represented them at 6 consecutive summits. I had spoken on a panel in 2020 about operational scaling in regional freight markets. I knew the room, the layout, the registration process, and the precise table positioning that the larger operators preferred. Janet had submitted Apex Freight Solutions as a first-time exhibitor in February. Standard booth, 10 by 10, positioned in the main hall. She had also, without telling me until April, submitted my name as a panelist for the keynote session on independent operator growth in contested markets. I had agreed to it without fully thinking through the geometry of what that meant until I was standing in the registration line on the morning of July 11th and looked across the lobby and saw my brother Dylan checking in at the corporate registration desk in a suit that finally looked like it had been pressed. He had not seen me yet. My father was 2 steps behind him. Richard Callahan at 62 looked exactly like himself, which is to say, he looked like a man who had always believed the room was slightly more interested in him than it actually was. He was scanning the lobby with the particular expression of a person who expects to be recognized. Janet appeared at my shoulder. "You didn't tell me they'd be here," I said. "I didn't know for certain," she said. "But I suspected. They haven't missed the summit in 8 years." I looked at her. "You knew," I said. She looked back at me with 17 years of composed financial precision in her expression. "I thought it was important that you were on that stage," she said, regardless of who was in the audience. I could not argue with that, so I picked up my name badge from the registration desk, clipped it to my jacket, and walked into the main hall. The panel began at 10:30 a.m. 4 operators on a raised platform at the front of a conference room that held approximately 250 people. The moderator was a woman named Diane Kowalski, a freight industry journalist I had spoken with twice before, who opened by asking each panelist to introduce themselves and describe what their company did. The 2 operators to my left went first. National players, household names in the industry. Then it was my turn. "Emma Walsh," I said, "founder and CEO of Apex Freight Solutions, based in Columbus. We're a 2-year-old independent operator focused on mid-market shippers in the Midwest. We currently manage approximately $8 million in annual freight under management across 42 active clients." Standard introduction. Clean. Specific. I did not look for my father in the audience until I had finished the sentence. When I did, I found him immediately, because he was already looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face in 31 years. It was the specific look of a man doing arithmetic he does not like the answer to. Dylan was beside him. Dylan was staring at my name badge. Diane Kowalski asked the panel what they believed was the most underestimated factor in building a freight operation from scratch. The first 2 panelists gave answers about capital and technology. When she reached me, I took one breath and answered honestly. "Institutional knowledge," I said. "The operators who scale fastest are almost never the ones with the most funding or the best software. They're the ones who have spent years inside an existing operation learning exactly where the inefficiencies live and exactly which clients are underserved. You can't buy that knowledge. You can only earn it. And once you have it, It is genuinely yours regardless of what anyone else decides to put their name on. The room responded the way rooms do when something lands that was not specifically intended as a performance but functions as one anyway. A murmur, a shift, heads turning slightly toward each other. I kept my eyes on Diane Kowalski. From the fourth row, I heard my father clear his throat. The session ran 50 minutes. I spoke 4 more times. Each answer was precise, industry-specific, and completely unremarkable to anyone who did not know the specific history sitting in the fourth row. To anyone who did, every word was a document. Afterward, there was a networking break. Coffee, industry conversation, the particular shuffle of people exchanging cards with one hand and balancing a cup with the other. I stepped off the platform, and Janet was immediately beside me with water and the quiet efficiency of someone who had been managing high-pressure rooms for nearly 2 decades. Gary Hoffmann found me within 4 minutes. He shook my hand, said the first month of the transition had been seamless, and told me he had already mentioned Apex to 2 of his industry contacts who would be reaching out. He said this at a volume that was not accidentally audible. I thanked him, genuinely. Gary Hoffmann owed me nothing, and he was choosing to stand next to me in a room where that choice meant something. My father reached me 7 minutes later. Dylan stayed 3 steps back, which told me everything about the internal conversation they had just had. Richard Callahan looked at me for a moment with the expression of a man who has prepared several opening lines and discarded all of them. "You built something," he said finally. "I did," I said. "You could have told me." I looked at him, at the man who had signed papers the night before my wedding specifically, so that the conversation we were having right now could never happen on my terms. "You could have asked me," I said, "at any point in 8 years. He had nothing for that. I watched him search for it and come back empty. Behind him, Dylan had the expression of someone who had recently discovered that a building he thought he owned had a structural problem nobody had mentioned to him at the time of transfer. I did not speak to Dylan. I looked at him once, directly, long enough to be deliberate. Then I turned back to Janet and moved on to the next conversation. Because I had said everything I needed to say. Not in that hallway. On that stage. In measured, professional language. In front of 250 people, with my name badge clipped to my jacket and Gary Hoffmann standing voluntarily at my shoulder. There was nothing left to add. Stay with me for the final part, because what happened between my father and me in the weeks after that summit was something I had not prepared myself for, and I am still, honestly, not sure how I feel about it. My father called 3 days after the summit. I was in the office reviewing carrier contracts when my phone lit up on the desk beside my keyboard. I looked at it for 2 full rings before I answered. Not because I was afraid of the conversation. Because I wanted to be certain I was ready to have it without wanting anything from it. That distinction matters more than it sounds. "I owe you an explanation," he said. I waited. I convinced myself it was the right decision for the company. That Dylan needed something to anchor him. That you were strong enough to land on your feet regardless. He paused. I told myself you'd be fine. "I am fine," I said. "I know that now." "You knew it then too," I said. That was never actually the reason. A long silence. The kind that has weight and texture and fills the space between 2 people who have been circling something true for years without landing on it directly. "No," he said finally. "It wasn't." I had waited 8 years for that sentence. 2 words. Quiet, undramatic, and more honest than anything Richard Callahan had said to me in a professional context since the day I walked into that Columbus warehouse in January 2014. I did not feel the satisfaction I had imagined I would feel. What I felt instead was something closer to exhaustion, the particular tiredness of a person who has been carrying a question for so long that even the answer doesn't fully lighten the load. "Why?" I said. Another silence. "Because Dylan needed it more than you did," he said. "And because I didn't know how to tell you that without admitting that I had spent years taking advantage of the fact that you didn't." I sat with that for a moment. Outside my office window, Troy was walking across the parking lot with a clipboard, talking to one of our drivers. Normal morning. Normal company. Built from scratch in 24 months by someone his father had bet against. "That's honest," I said. "I'll give you that." "It's not enough," he said. "No," I said. "It isn't." We did not reconcile in the way that word is usually meant. There was no dinner, no tearful embrace, No afternoon where everything was laid out and forgiven and repackaged into something comfortable. I am 31 years old, and I have learned enough about my family to know that we are not built for that kind of resolution. What we built instead was something smaller and more real. My father started calling on Sunday evenings. Short calls, 10-15 minutes. He asked about the business with the specific curiosity of a man who is trying to learn something rather than assess something, and that difference was new enough that I noticed it every time. I answered his questions honestly. I did not ask for his approval. I did not offer more than he asked for. But I stayed on the line, and I spoke to him like a person I had decided to remain in contact with on terms I had chosen myself. That is not forgiveness in the cinematic sense, but it is something, and I am the one who decides what it grows into. Dylan called once, 4 weeks after the summit. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that was 2 minutes and 14 seconds long and contained the word unfair 3 times. I listened to it once, deleted it, and sent him a text that said I hoped the business was going well and that I wished him genuinely the best. I meant the last part more than he probably believed. Janet still has that letter framed on her office wall. The Hoffmann confirmation. She never added a caption, and I never asked her to take it down. Gary Hoffmann referred 2 clients to us before the end of 2024. Both converted. Both are still with us. Apex Freight Solutions closed the year at $11.2 million in revenue. 38 employees. 61 active clients across 5 states. I drive a 4-year-old Subaru. I eat lunch at my desk more days than not. I answer emails before 6 a.m. because the quiet before the building fills is still my favorite part of any day. None of that has changed from the version of me that used to do all of it for someone else's company. What has changed is whose name is on the door. I want to talk to you directly for a moment, not about logistics, not about family business or transfer agreements or contract values, about what it actually costs to build something inside a structure that was never going to credit you for it. I spent 8 years making myself indispensable to a company that had already decided I was interchangeable. I told myself that the work would speak for itself, that results were their own argument, that if I was good enough for long enough the recognition would eventually arrive on its own. It didn't. And here is what I know now that I wish I had understood in 2014. Results inside someone else's structure belong to that structure. The skills that produce those results belong to you. They cannot sign those over. They cannot transfer them in a lawyer's office the night before your wedding. They cannot hand them to a founder's son in a corner office with a window overlooking the loading dock. Everything you learn, every system you build, every relationship you earn, every problem you solve at 11 p.m. while someone else is at a rooftop bar somewhere, all of it lives in you. Permanently. Portably. Entirely yours. The only mistake I made was waiting for permission to use it independently. I will not make that mistake again. If you are watching this, and you are the person in your family's business who does the work that someone else takes credit for, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not trapped by what you have built for them. You are equipped by it. The gap between where you are and where you could be is not talent. It is not capital. It is not connection. It is the decision to stop building someone else's ceiling and start building your own floor. That decision does not require an announcement. It does not require a confrontation. It does not require anyone's blessing, least of all the person who underestimated you. It only requires you to open a document, type a name at the top of an empty page, and begin. The rest is just work. And if you have survived inside a system that never fully valued you, I promise you already know how to work. What would you have done in my position? Would you have walked away sooner or stayed and fought from the inside? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, if any part of it felt like something you have lived or are living right now, subscribe. Because I have more of these stories, and the next one involves a business partner, a forged signature, and a courtroom in downtown Cincinnati where I sat in the 3rd row and watched someone realize too late that paper trails are permanent. You're going to want to be there for that one.